Welcome everyone to the 5th episode of the Automotive History series. In this series I'm going to cover the most funny, interesting and juicy stories of automotive history. But without further ado, let's get started. I want you to go back to the lobby, get some snacks, get back, sit back, relax and enjoy. And today we're going to look at something that did not happen 50 years ago or could only be remembered by your grandparents fondly. No, this episode we're going to look at something that happened a little more recent, let's say about 20 years ago. And there is a high chance that you might remember this as well. I, for instance, was a young kid at the time. And that is the retro wave of the early 2000s. And by retro wave, I don't mean the music style, but I mean the practice of giving new cars a retro look that car manufacturers all over the world seem to apply to their cars in the early 2000s. The year is 1999, and people were celebrating it like it was
No, God, please, no! 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 No!
Okay, sorry, I didn't know you would get pissed off. I'm sorry, okay? Anyway, the new century, new millennium was just around the corner and everyone was excited, including car manufacturers. And what is a better way to look at the future by looking into the past? Now, before we continue, I tried to look up where this desire of creating retro cars came from. And honestly, I couldn't really find an answer. Because as soon as I look up retro designed cars, I get tons and tons of clickbait articles that make lists of the top 10 cars that succeeded with a retro design and top 10 cars that failed, and you know the drill. But they all only show examples and not the reason or history behind it. The only reason I can think of are those dang baby boomers that want to buy cars with their retirement fund that remind them of the good old days. But I want to grab this moment in a way to hit the 10-minute mark somehow to tell you something about the fact that retro design is nothing new. Because it seems like that in the 1960s and the 1970s already people started to make use of hashtag Throwback Thursday, especially in the so-called Brougham Era of the 1970s. Especially the American personal luxury car market was notorious of bringing back styling cues from the very early days of motoring. And for me, a good example is the 1975 Chevrolet Monte Carlo, a personal luxury car. Look at the overall shape and belt line of this car. That kind of reminds me of the running boards of 1930s cars and the front and rear fenders of 1940s cars. And if my very complex mathematics are correct, that means that a 1970s car takes design inspiration from cars that back then were made 30 or 40 years ago. But there are a lot more worse examples. Think about waterfall grills that were a throwback to the large grills that dominated cars in the 1930s. Think of the Brougham name, which was a throwback to a type of carriage from the days before the turn of the 20th century. And also, look at this carriage. As you can see, a part of the roof is black. Well, there are numerous examples of cars that had vinyl roofs that looked exactly like this. And, you want me to say it? Should I say it? Wood. But it didn't stop there. In the 1980s, you had the rise of the neoclassical cars. These were often inspired by luxurious roadsters of the 1930s, but they all looked poorly executed, gaudy, and maybe even shoddy. And then suddenly the Japanese started to fall in love with retro cars in the late 80s and early 90s. One good example are Nissan's Pike cars. Cars such as the Nissan BE1, the Nissan S-Cargo, the Nissan POW, and the Nissan Figaro. And a little more information about the Figaro. I once encountered one of these on the street and I was genuinely surprised and fooled. Being the veteran car spotter I am, most of the time I can instantly tell what car I'm looking at. But this time I had a hard time, because the exterior of the car had all the little traits that you could find in classic cars from Europe in the 1950s and 60s. Things like the chrome exterior trim. But as soon as I looked at the interior, I was confused, because the interior looked a little more modern than what I would expect from a car that looked like it came out of the 1950s and 60s. And I was completely blown away by the fact when I looked up the license plate that it turned out that the construction year of this car was 1991. Good job, Nissan. You got me. But back to the future. Because what I'm trying to tell you is that the practice of looking back 30 or 40 years ago to draw some design inspiration is nothing new. It happened in the 1970s and it also happened in the early 2000s, and it will probably also happen again in the future. History repeats itself. Now, I figured out all by myself 3 ways how a car manufacturer can come up with a retro design car. The first way is what I like to call the revival strategy. You develop a new car, give it retro looks, and you rely on old legendary nameplates. And good examples are the new Fiat 500 and the new Mini Cooper. They both were new cars in the early 2000s, had a retro styling, and used nameplates that were legendary in Europe in the 1950s and the 1960s. The second way is what I like to call the fake revival strategy. And this way you develop a new car, give it retro looks, but also come up with a new nameplate which has no connection with history at all. And good examples are the Chevrolet HHR and the Nissan Figaro, which I mentioned earlier. Because the Figaro was new when it came out all the way back in the 90s, and the car did have retro styling, but was inspired by European cars of the 1950s and the 1960s. Also, Nissan never used the Figaro nameplate before this car came out. What I'm trying to say is that the Nissan Figaro tries to be hipster and tries to fall back on a rich history that never was. Thus, the fake revival strategy. The last way of coming up with a retro car is what I like to call the retro generation strategy. And this applies to car nameplates that already have a very long history, and a very good example is the Ford Mustang. The Mustang nameplate dates back from the 1960s, but by the early 2000s, the 4th generation Mustang looked more contemporary than retro. And while the 5th generation was coming up in a time when everybody was already putting out retro cars, Ford thought that it might be an excellent idea to give the new Ford Mustang retro looks. But the difference here is that it is a new generation that looks retro and not an attempt to revive a legendary nameplate, because the Mustang over the course from the 1960s until now never went away. Okay, enough about these strategies and on to the examples. We're going to look at the cars that car manufacturers all over the world brought out in the early 2000s. And we're going to look at them one continent at a time. Oh, and I'm only looking at regular production models. Besides regular car models, car manufacturers also brought out loads of retro-styled concept cars. But I will only cover these concept cars if they are either important or relevant to the story. And the first continent we'll start off with is the good old US of A. And the Chrysler Corporation was among the first by launching the Plymouth Prowler, a sporty roadster with its design that dates back from 1930s hot rods. But if you think that the Prowler is a little too much for you, then you can always choose for the more pedestrian PT Cruiser. It has been said that the PT Cruiser was inspired by the 1930s Chrysler Airflow. But I don't really buy that, because to me it looks more like a generic late 1930s car than a futuristic 1930s aerodynamic car. Next up is Ford, who thought it would be a good idea to retronize their performance cars, including the Ford Mustang, which I talked about earlier, and also the Ford GT, which was inspired by the Ford GT40 from the 1960s and almost looked identical to the original. And last but not least, a reintroduction of the almighty Ford Thunderbird, but that really didn't turn out all too well. The T-Bird was once again a true personal luxury car, but the personal luxury car market by then was already dead for 20 years. A little late to the retro party was General Motors, but GM gave Chevrolet the HHR and the SSR, both very unique cars, and inspired by the Chevrolet's late 40s and early 50s advanced design pickup trucks. Also, when Ford decided to give the new Mustang a retro look, and Chrysler following with the new retro-style Dodge Challenger, Chevrolet thought, okay, if it's a new horsepower war you want, then it'll be a new horsepower war you'll get. And so they reintroduced the Chevrolet Camaro. Next up is Europe, because if there is one continent that has a very rich history of car models, it's Europe. Volkswagen was among one of the first manufacturers to come out with a brand new Beetle, but this time it was a trendy city car instead of a basic transportation A to B car, like its original predecessor, and I think that's one of the reasons why it never really sold that well and is now scrapped. And then oddly enough, BMW was the manufacturer that relaunched the classic Mini, which was also a trendy city car. Then Fiat came up with their new Fiat 500, which is also a trendy city car. Man, I don't know what it is with these small trendy city cars, but what's a man gotta do to get a full-size sedan around here? Well, over in Britain, Jaguar launched the Jaguar S-Type, which was inspired by the mid-60s Jaguar S-Type. And the Rolls-Royces featured a design that was as conservative as Brexit voters that it almost looked instantly retro. And you also had the retro-style Rover 75. Remarkably, not so much news from France. The only good examples I could find were over at Citroën, the funky French car maker they are. One of which is the Citroën C6, somewhat of a retro successor to the almighty Citroën DS from the 1950s, and also the Citroën C3 Pluriel, a car that almost looked more like a Fiat 500 than a Fiat 500. Now, I might have forgotten a car or two in Europe, but let's move over to Asia. Because strangely enough, Asia wasn't really caught up in the retro craze. Other than the Toyota FJ Cruiser, which is a retro version of the Toyota Land Cruiser from the 60s, there isn't really that much else. Or is there? I'm not really that familiar with the Japanese Kei car or Kei car, whatever, but it seems like that these cars sometimes get a funky design, such as the Daihatsu Mira Gino and the Daihatsu Copen. But what I am familiar with is, and oh, here we go, Mitsuoka. Mitsuoka. God, I butchered that, didn't I? Anyway, this is a small Japanese company making interesting retro cars out of everyday, regular production cars. And I really want to recommend you to check out their website. It's almost like you're entering a fake and fishy Grand Theft Auto 5 website. But don't you worry, their business are legit. And you can buy their models such as the Galio, Ryuji, Vute, and the brand new Rockstar. This video is sponsored by Mitsuoka. Our last stop will be in Australia. And no, I'm not gonna do an Australian accent because I suck at it. The only expression I can say with an Australian accent is chain her, which is the exact same way as Donald Trump trying to say the word China. But anyway, looking at Australia, we are quickly finished. The only example I could think of was the Holden concept, which paid a tribute to the original 1953 Holden FJ. But then again, I don't really expect a nation that is constantly battling kangaroos, everything that moves, that is trying to kill you, and the insufferable heat is going to think of retro-styled cars. And with that, I want to end this episode. Thank you for listening, and remember to like and subscribe to my channel if you want more of this. And make sure that you follow me on Instagram. It's where I post cars that I found in the wild on the street, along with some interesting facts or a story, something like that. None of that promotional or irrelevant bullshit. So once again, thank you, and see you in the next video.